that's great.
Huh?
Yep.
Should we get started?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Take it away,
Is
Freddie.
this on?
It's on.
Can you hear me okay?
A little closer. Yeah.
Is that better?
Yes.
Is that better? There we go,
Yes.
I can hear it.
I'm just gonna move it closer to you.
Yeah, because she's
It'll be a little bit in your face. There you go.
Okay, that's great.
Perfect.
Good, okay, thank you. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hi, thank you for having me. My name is Fredie Kay, and I'm the founder and president of Suffrage100 Massachusetts. Our table is right over here. Georgina Arietta Rutnick is with me, our board member. And so we have materials for those of you who are here today. I hope you come stop by our table. It is my honor and privilege to share a few words with you. I will disclose that I wrote a new piece for today, and I hope it works.
Game changer.
Yeah, I hope it works. So I want to thank everyone who's here today and say that we don't take it lightly that you're spending your Saturday afternoon here with us, which is really wonderful. It's very precious, and it says a lot about you and your goals and what you want to do, so thank you so much for joining us. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that here in Lynn, the area that is now known as Lynn was inhabited by thousands of years by Native Americans prior to English colonization in the 1600s. We are standing here in the area today that was the indigenous land of the Namkik people under the powerful Sachem of Namampasnet, who controlled territory from Mystic to the Merrimack Rivers. As this is Women's History Month and Suffrage100 Massachusetts focuses on women and voting, please know that Indigenous women and many women of color were active in the women's suffrage movement. For those who are new to the term suffrage, it means to vote. It was a Latin word, I believe. And so they were active in the women's suffrage movement in the United States, despite knowing that even though the 19th Amendment does not discriminate, the 19th Amendment states very cleanly that the federal and state governments may not discriminate for voting on the basis of sex. Other laws prevented people of color from voting, separate laws. And so people of color, including Indigenous people, African Americans, Asian Americans, and others, fought hard for the vote in the 19th Amendment with the idea that they could tackle those other laws and therefore the 19th Amendment would apply to them. And that is in fact what happened. So as you know, this is Women's History event, Women's History Month event, so it's important to take a moment and to ask ourselves, why do we need a Women's History Month event? And how was it created? So I have put something together that will summarize that for us, I hope. You know the phrase that a picture is worth 1,000 words? I found this, that something I had gotten from my kids, that would be a few years ago. This is a placemat, and it's a placemat of the presidents of the United States. And what do we see? All white men. There's one exception, it's Barack Obama, he's right here. But it took,
How many years?
it took hundreds of years before he was elected. But a picture is worth 1,000 words, so sometimes when I'm asked the question, well, what is patriarchy, and is our world still patriarchal? I will just show them this and say no more. I do want to acknowledge and thank the fact that we do have Kamala Harris as our vice president. A round of applause for Kamala Harris. And to recognize as well that our governor is Maura Healey and our lieutenant governor is Kim Driscoll. We are very lucky to live in this state with two women at the helm. So let's give it up for her. So it remains, despite some of that good news, what I would say is clearly a patriarchal society. So if you're ever asked what is patriarchy, then you could talk about something like that. So let me just see, I just catch up with my notes here. I want to shout out two women. One is, I'm sure you're thinking as we look at that picture of all these men who've been elected president, and except for Barack Obama, all white men. Of course, we're thinking of Hillary Clinton, who came close, really close. But you should also know, if you don't already, about Victoria Woodhull, who ran for president in 1872. That was amazing. And her candidacy was not taken seriously, but she ran for president. And she was the first woman to run for president. And of course, Shirley Chisholm and others came later, but we're still at it. So it sure is taking forever, you could say. And please know that other countries are way ahead of us, of the United States, and have elected women as their leaders. So we look forward to that here as well. The other thing is that this is a photo of presidents. So it speaks to the issue of government and our governmental leaders, but it also represents other spheres, even though we don't have pictures of them, which are the other spheres where it is still patriarchal predominantly, and that's academia, the arts, athletics, education, business, industry, medicine. The list goes on and on. And yes, strides have been made, but we need to keep in mind that all of those areas are ones in which women are still fighting to have their due and be part of that. So the assumptions way back when were that women had limited abilities, that they could not achieve what men achieved. And the discrimination was even more pervasive for women of color. So having to overcome those assumptions to break glass ceilings and prove that we could do it and can do it and have done it. So women have contributed enormously, despite those glass ceilings, despite the assumptions of women's limited abilities or whatever. Women persevered nonetheless and achieved greatly. So one of the reasons that Women's History Month is so important is because we can lift up and amplify those women who have achieved miraculously, if you will, but through hard work and determination to break through. And for folks to know that Women's History Month is fairly recent. It was created because of the need for people to know that despite the discrimination and the assumptions about what white women and women of color could or couldn't achieve, women have made enormous contributions and are making enormous contributions. So even though the women were not in charge, they were doing extraordinary things that we were never taught. A group of mostly women and some men wanted to change that. It was 1978, not so long ago for many of us, that women in California, the California Commission on the Status of Women, got together and began to have 1 week of Women's History celebration, and they scheduled it to coincide with March 8th, with International Women's Day, which many of us were together yesterday in Boston at Simmons University to celebrate International Women's Day. 2 years later, in 1980, the National Women's History Alliance, they had another name back then, but that's what they are, lobbied until President Carter issued a proclamation declaring the week of March 8 as National Women's History Week. So how did we end up with National Women's History Month? In 1987, a few years later, Congress passed resolutions that authorized the president, whoever is the president, to proclaim March Women's History Month each year. And since 1995, which happens to be the year my son was born, not so long ago, each president has proclaimed March as Women's History Month. So that group from California that lobbied Congress to make March Women's History Month, and I want to show you their national magazine, which is still out. This has just come out. They're still at it, and I'm very excited to say that Massachusetts got a shout out, and this is from our marker event where we were unveiling the event for Mariah Baldwin in Cambridge, an African American woman who was an incredible teacher in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and worked very hard for abolition and for suffrage, to end lynchings at that point. The Civil War was over, but lynchings were happening at a terrible rate, and worked hard for women to get the vote from Cambridge, and worked with Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin. Together, they created the Women's Era.
There's a school named after her.
Yes, there is. Yes, and we almost put the marker there, but ended up putting it at her house, where she gave talks with that were very famous, that were there, which were great. So this idea from a group of women, we're talking about change makers. These were change makers who now, we are here today, and there are groups all around the country commemorating Women's History Month with events like this. So it's a great thing. So it's a terrific example with a kernel of an idea what women can do and make it happen. So now I'd like to turn briefly to a little bit about Massachusetts and what we're doing here, and a little bit about our history of Suffrage 100 Massachusetts. In 2004, I saw an HBO movie, so it was not being shown on the big screen anywhere. It is called Iron Jawed Angels. And that movie stars Hilary Swank. I don't know if the young folks recognize the name Hilary Swank. She's a great actor, playing Alice Paul. And that movie, it changed my life, and it changed the lives of many other people. And I had already been a feminist. I had already known about the suffrage movement, but not like this. It was an amazing movie. So it tells the story of the suffrage movement the last 10 or so years. The suffragists had been working since 1848, which was the first time that women as a group had voted with men to endorse the idea that women should get the vote. Prior to that, the Grimke sisters and others had called for women to get the vote, but this was the first time there was an organized meeting for women to get the vote. And that was 1848 in Seneca Falls. There were a long list of things called the Declaration of Sentiments. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton was charged with writing this. She was in her 30s. She was a young woman, had just moved from Boston. Her husband wanted a small town for a practice. They were in Seneca Falls. And she was charged with writing their wish list of what they wanted. So she used our Declaration of Independence to use that, and made this the Declaration of Sentiments, and insisted on including the right to vote. Many in the audience were opposed. They thought it was too much, that it would jeopardize their obtaining other rights, like basic property rights, which were not theirs. If your husband died, you were married and your husband died, your son had control and rights to the property over the mother. And frequently the sons had other ideas about what they wanted to do. And they would sell the property or tell mom she had to leave. And these cases were debated. Many of these women went to see Elizabeth Cady Stanton's father, who was an attorney and a judge. And they would come to him for help, and she would listen and hear these cases, and it enraged her to hear what would happen, that you would use things, because women had no property rights. His law clerks made fun of her because she had a necklace. Her father had given her a coral necklace, which was her prized one piece of jewelry that she loved. And the law clerks would make fun of her and say, you know, when you get married, your husband will own your necklace. And if he wants to sell it, he can sell it for tobacco and smoke it up. And it just hurt her to the core and said, these laws have to change. So in front at the Seneca Falls Convention, there was a debate about whether to include the right to vote. Frederick Douglass had come from Rochester, where he was living at the time, and he agreed with Elizabeth Cady Stanton that it was a core value. Women had to have the right to vote, and he helped convince, along with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, enough of the people present that they should endorse this for women to have the right to vote. It was adopted, but it was the only item on their list that was not adopted unanimously. And it foretold how challenging this was going to be. That was 1848, and that's why we date 72 years to the 19th Amendment in 1920 was from 1848. I'll give you another piece of history that I'll turn back to my prepared remarks, which was, that was 1848. It was a regional convention. It was the first women's rights convention in the country. 1850 and 1851 were the first national women's rights conventions. Where? Worcester. We have Worcester here. Worcester, Massachusetts at Brimley Hall in 1850 and 1851. They had 1,000 people attending. 11 states were represented in 1850 and 3,000 people attended in 1851. So that was the first time it had become national, and then those happened for another 10 years or so until the Civil War. So that's just a snippet of some of the history we like to highlight that's so important. So fast forward, you know, we have this effort, you have the Civil War comes in, there's a lot going on with the organizations, there's a lot of controversy, a lot of dissent and issues happening. You get to the 1900s, and in comes a woman named Alice Paul. And yes, I am moving quickly through a lot of history, I just don't think there's time to go into it all. But this movie, I'm coming back to the movie that I mentioned, Iron Jawed Angels. It's a woman named Alice Paul who's from New Jersey, a white woman. She had gone to England for like her second master's degree in economics, which was very rare at that time in the world for women to be doing that. And she heard about a meeting, rode her bike in the dark to a meeting where Emmeline Pankhurst's daughter, Christabel Pankhurst, was speaking. One of the things that happened was Christabel spoke, and most of the students were men. This was economics. And they threw rotten fruit at Christabel. And it happened to her many times. There are stories here in the States in the 1800s about how that happened here in the States to many women, because women were not supposed to speak in public. If you spoke to a crowd that was men and women, it was called, I just lost the word, I'm so sorry, a crowd that was not okay, and women were not supposed to speak to a mixed crowd. So she was outraged by that. She was brought up as a Quaker in New Jersey, and long story short, she became radicalized, joined the suffrage movement in England, and where they, unlike the United States, they were blowing up buildings, they were throwing rocks, they were blowing up mailboxes, and they were being arrested and sent to jail, where they went on hunger strikes to get attention. This was all because they wanted attention to the cause, to get more people to the cause. And then they were force-fed, and it was nasty. And I think Alice Paul went to jail over 60 times when this happened to her. And she and a friend she made, they met in jail, I think, was Lucy Burns, who was from New York, and the two of them met, came back to the States, and the large 1913 parade, which many of you may have heard about, that happened in Washington, was Alice Paul and Lucy Burns deciding we're gonna have a parade to focus on the 19th Amendment, because they looked at the clock. There had been efforts to go state by state by state to get the vote, and an effort for a constitutional amendment, but the state by state effort was just going nowhere fast. I think there were 11 states had adopted that women could vote after 50 years. And there were 36 states in the country at the time. So they said, enough, we need to focus on a constitutional amendment. We need to get this constitutional amendment so everybody can vote. I will mention that in England, the suffragists, ISTS, who were fighting for the vote and became radical, blowing up buildings and so forth, the newspapers dubbed them the suffragettes. They were trying to make fun of them. Emmeline Pankhurst and the leadership over there said, fine, we'll take it, call us the suffragettes, we don't care. So that term is really British, and it's really about the British women who were fighting over there and were much more radicalized. In the States, they sometimes were called the suffragettes, but the group in the United States never broke laws. They were always peaceful demonstrations. They were, in fact, were silent sentinels. They didn't even speak. They only held signs. And that was the first group ever to picket the White House were the suffragists in 1917 that started. And part of that is in this film as well, but they were arrested and jailed. And also went on hunger strikes and were force fed. And hence, I think that's part of the name is Iron-Jawed Angels. Now, I know this is old school to have a CD, but there is a CD for anybody who still has them. And if people want to take a picture of this later and find it to see, I know HBO has it, I don't know. We used to be able to stream it easily, now not so much, but hopefully you can. I highly recommend this film. So when I saw the film, I decided, well, I want everybody to see this. And I can tell you, I have read so many books since then, in 2004, and the introductions and the forewords in many of the books talk about having seen this movie. So I wasn't alone. There were others who were moved quite a bit by it. So 2010 was the 90th anniversary of women getting the vote, and I was asked by Martha Coakley, who was then Attorney General, Fredie, is there anything you'd like to do for the 90th? Yes, this movie, I want to show this movie. So we showed the movie at the Institute for Contemporary Art, and that was our event, which was great. So that was for the 90th. We focused on the 100th coming up in 2020, did lots of events. Please check out our website, Suffrage100 MA, where every year at the Swan Butts, League of Women Voters joins us and several others to commemorate the day when the 19th Amendment was added to the Constitution. And that was after this incredible battle in Tennessee. So we've been doing that for years and several other things. And then we came upon the pandemic. 2020, the big centennial that we've been working towards, was 2020. We had reserved the Boston Common. We were going to have a big parade in March, and we couldn't do it. I'm going to slip in one other piece of history because I think it's really interesting, and that's about parades and marches. They were starting to take place all over. Many of you, along with me, may have been present in 2017 in January on that frigid, frigid day when we were in Boston for the Boston Women's March, right? So, and you'll remember how crowded it was. There were tons of people. There were 175,000 people on the Boston Common. Well, I later learned that in 1915, Massachusetts was still trying to get the vote state by state. Even though this effort was going on nationally, they were still trying. It was on the ballot to give women the vote in the state of Massachusetts. And the effort that went on through this Commonwealth was massive. For 2 years, they tried really hard. And they had a parade in downtown Boston in 1915. No cell phones, no computers, they barely had telephones. 500,000 people were in Boston for this parade. And the year before, 1914, they had 200,000 to 300,000 people. So it just tells you, and the efforts were enormous, and some of this you get to read about on our new website. So I just wanted to share that with you. Let me just try to catch up with my notes a little bit. Make sure I'm on track here. So we're about to show a film. It's a short video that summarizes our past 13 years of Suffrage100 MA. And we're about to have a major transition coming up on March 22nd, but I hope you'll enjoy this film. The music was written by Laura Harrington, who lives in Gloucester, I believe. And, am I right? It's Gloucester. She wrote a musical about Tennessee, the last state that finally gave the vote to women. And without Tennessee, we would not have the 19th Amendment. She wrote this song pleading to the men why they should vote for women to have the vote, and the name of the song is A Woman's Voice. And that's the music that we have to background with some pictures of our past 13 years. Take it away. Thank you.